Okay, so let's talk about source B now. Let's have a look at this one. So the first one was a will, which we can probably assume is going to be reasonably reliable. Okay, so I think I forgot to talk about reliability when I was recording for that one. This one is probably even more reliable because it's parish boundary. So this is just fact. It's a legal document. There's no vested interest here. It is just facts, i.e., it is lines on a map, effectively. So what do these lines show? Okay, so we've got something about a diocese, something about a parish. Now we should know those words. We've come across them before, but just to be clear, if we don't, a diocese is basically it's another word for bishopric. So a diocese is an area controlled by a bishop. Okay, and then a parish is a kind of smaller religious sort of unit, and that is the area controlled by a local church. So, for instance, TBSHS, our school, we are in the parish of St Michael's, because St Michael's Church would be our local church. That would be responsible for kind of our area. So, what we're looking at here is we're looking at a particular diocese. We're looking at Worcester. So, that's the area controlled by the Bishop of Worcester, which is in Mercia. And we're looking at the boundaries of the parishes within that area. So the different sort of churches that are there. Now, obviously, if those, if there had been some major religious disruption, we might expect those to change. Okay, we might expect perhaps a couple of churches to get destroyed, so certain parishes might have to get bigger because a church has gone missing. All right, we would expect that to shift a little bit if there had been some kind of big religious disruption of the kind that we might expect to see happening due to sort of massive Viking invasion or something along those lines. So this suggests that in Worcester, if you look at the boundaries of the parishes in the 11th and 12th century, so a couple of hundred years later, they actually seem to be pretty much the same as where the parishes were before 800. So if you remember, the first Viking attack is Lindisfarne, 793. So essentially that's right at the start of the Viking period, down to a good couple of hundred years later. So what that is suggesting is nothing's really changed. So does that suggest that the church is having a bad time? Does that suggest the church has really suffered during this period? Does that suggest that things are going really poorly? We just saw in source A, someone thought that churches were going to completely disappear. They weren't going to survive. Has that happened here? If all those boundary lines are the same, does that suggest there's been a lot of change happening? Not really. Okay, so let's try and add some own knowledge to this, try and make a little bit more of a sense of it. So we're talking about Worcester here, so we're talking about Mercia. We're talking about the western part of Mercia. So Worcester is kind of over the side where you would, the Welsh side, basically, over to the left. Now, we know that Worcester actually was kind of doing all right. It was one of the areas that wasn't as badly impacted by Viking attacks. Why was that? Well, because they were ruled by Ceolwulf, all right? They were ruled by the Viking puppet, so they weren't attacked in the same way as other kingdoms. So if we look at what's happening in places like East Anglia, obviously Edmund is killed, their king is slaughtered by Viking attacks, complete disruption going on there, and obviously the Vikings ultimately making it part of the Danelaw. Worcester is not part of the Danelaw. Worcester is part of English Mercia ruled by the puppet Ceolwulf. So Worcester is not damaged in the same way. And we know that for a variety of pieces of evidence, one of which being there's something actually called the Worcester Charters, which were produced during Ceolwulf's reign. And those charters, the Latin's really good. All right, so you contrast that to the charters we're seeing in Kent, where whoever's writing them clearly hasn't got a clue what they're doing. The charters being produced during Ceolwulf's reign, we know were actually, broadly speaking, pretty good Latin-wise. Another piece of evidence that we know that Worcester wasn't as badly impacted is, well, when Alfred's trying to find scholars to help him get his programme sorted, where does he look? He looks over at Worcester. He looks to Mercia, doesn't he? He calls people like Werfurth and Werewolf and Athelstan and these scholars from Mercia. In fact, Werfurth is the Bishop of Worcester. And Werfurth is one of the top scholars he invites over to come and be part of his learning programme. So clearly, Worcester and that part of Mercia wasn't as badly impacted. So perhaps we could argue here it's not typical. We know, again, another little bit of own knowledge that we could throw in here is we know that elsewhere bishoprics are actually disappearing. So two ones to remember that completely disappear before and after the Viking raids have happened are Hexham, which is in Northumbria, and Leicester, which is in the Five Boroughs. So what we would call Danish Mercia at this time. It's part of the Danelaw. So Hexham and Leicester, they both disappear. Worcester, meanwhile, according to this source, stays the same. All right, so clearly, not everywhere is being impacted quite as badly as everywhere. So it's not all quite the same. Okay, so what this source would suggest is that in Worcester, in Mercia, the impact of Viking invasion was not quite as serious, which does match what we know as well. Though, what I would stress, and I'll put a comment here, is just because they're not actually being impacted by Vikings, does that mean all the monks are doing their jobs properly? Don't know. Alright, so that's source B. Okay, try and turn all that over in your brain and think, okay, so what does that tell me? Does this suggest we need to reform?